I don't care if somebody had to mark the fretboard with the notes or something, or if they didn't even care what notes they played. It didn't matter. It was the feeling they put into it. It was the enthusiasm that they had.
Hello and welcome to episode 8 of the Who Cares Anyway podcast. My guest on this episode is Denny DeGorio, or to use his punk pseudonym, Denny Boredom. That's how he's credited on the record whose cover I appropriated for this episode's artwork, and that would be the second single by The Offs, San Francisco's sort of answer to The Clash in terms of punk, reggae, fusion, although they did some other things as well. But Denny DeGorio was a member of The Offs, beginning in about 1978, and as we'll hear, he was really there from the very beginning of the Mabuhay Gardens era. He played in several other bands locally, including a couple of legendary, largely unheard bands, the Belfast Cowboys and Clocks of Paradise. Unheard in the sense of there are not really any recordings to speak of. He also played with Jefferson Airplane guitarist Jorma Kaukonen in his solo act. I should say Jefferson Airplane and Hot Tuna guitarist Jorma Kaukonen in his solo act during this same era, and so that gave Denny a sort of different perspective on the punk hippie divide that was so prevalent in those days. And then after leaving San Francisco and moving to Austin, he reconnected with a couple of old friends in Alejandro and Javier Escovedo in a band called The True Believers that had a pretty good run, including an LP on a major label in 1985 with producer Jim Dickinson at the helm. And so we'll hear a little bit about that toward the end. In addition to his touring and recording resume, Denny was friends with a lot of the key players in the early San Francisco punk scene who are no longer with us, and that would include Will Shatter from Flipper, Jimmy Wilsey from the Avengers, Tony Kinman from the Dills, and Michael Belfer from the Sleepers. And it was that connection to Michael that sort of prompted my initial contact with Denny back in 2017 when I interviewed him for the book. And that's sort of what we were talking about as this interview sort of got underway. So there's a bit of a reference to Michael there at the beginning. But having said all that, I'll go ahead and step aside and let us get on with the interview. But a big thanks to Denny DeGorio, a wonderful storyteller and raconteur, for doing this interview. And I hope you enjoy it as much as I enjoyed talking to him. You were from Vallejo, is that right?
Right. Yeah, I was from Vallejo. I didn't meet Michael until I'd moved to San Francisco, and I met him just as being part of the San Francisco music scene. As big and varied as it was, including everything from artists, performance artists, musicians, aspiring writers and filmmakers, and magazine publishers and so forth. Despite that, it was very almost familial, kind of incestuous in some ways, and in some way, and it was kind of like the Island of Misfit Toys or something, a bunch of broken people in different ways sort of bonded over the whole punk rock genre, and a lot of us, didn't have good family situations. I imagine, I know that was the case with me and a lot of the people I was close to. So it was kind of the family that we didn't have in a lot of ways. So I got to know everybody, and pretty quickly too. I mean, there were a lot of parties after the shows and parties after the parties, and you know, everybody got pretty close because of that. So it was a pretty cool scene. It's something that even though it was a few years, it really was a part of my developmental years, I guess, because it really stuck with me. But I think more so than even high school and any of the experiences I had growing up prior to that.
How did you make your way up there, or as far as finding out about that music scene? What is it, 30, 40 minutes away? Or how do you even how did you get from Vallejo to the city?
Right. Vallejo is about 30 miles north of San Francisco, and it's on the bay. It's on the North Bay. So we can actually take a ferry to San Francisco from Vallejo. But I had a car, and I would drive there. Now, I'd been going to San Francisco since I was 10 years old, you know. So I was really familiar with San Francisco, and I remember just being down there and seeing posters on the telephone poles and walls and of shops and stuff like that. And at first it was just bands, all kinds of bands, not really punk rock per se. But little by little, the punk rock bands started playing, and pretty soon it had turned into a full-fledged scene. But I started going to Mabuhay almost right from the beginning. As soon as they were playing shows with any regularity, and I remember the early punk scene with I don't know, bands like WCA, and meeting Michael Kowalski and Don Vinyl, the singer of the Offs, was one of the early folks, and Will and the Flipper guys, and just too many people to mention, really. So first, I worked at a record store, and at first I used to close up the record store, and I would go straight to the Mabuhay every night. And after a while, after a short time, really, I'd met so many people. I ended up finding a opportunity to rent a room at 3307 Mission Street, right at 29th and Mission. And it was with Don Vinell. Let's see, Jello Biafra was my other roommate. I probably mentioned this already.
That's okay, because I didn't know the address, and I'd heard about that house, and I wanted to ask you about it anyway, because it's kind of legendary but mysterious. Or
yeah. Well, it's one of the few addresses that I've lived at that I remember the address. I mean, you know, so it left a big impression on me. Let's see, Jello, Bruce Luce from Flipper. Oh gosh, Guy Lopez, who had been in the Zeros briefly, and Tony from the Dills lived there for a little while. Anyway, and it was a bit of a revolving door, and of course, all the bands that came up there to play from along the coast, anywhere from LA to up to Vancouver, BC. A lot of them would, you know, stay there when they had gigs, and you know, the various punk rock scenes were also connected. We were friendly with all the bands, and we would pretty much couch surf at each other's punk rock flats and support each other's music, you know, as best we could.
But you were living there before you joined the Offs, or was that all kind of in the same?
Well, according to my memory right now, I believe because see, I already knew everyone. But I believe that I had already moved in before I joined. And I think it was Don Vinyl that asked me if I wanted to get a room there. And I already knew him, and I vaguely knew everybody to varying degrees. Because I would go to everybody's show. I was a big fan of everyone. I mean, it wasn't even, it almost didn't matter what people sounded like to me back then, because I was just so enthusiastic about the scene, you know. Even if I wasn't crazy about the music, I was enthusiastic about the creativity and I just found the whole thing really exhilarating. So that made me pretty likable. I mean, when you like everybody, people tend to like you. So
That's good advice.
yeah.
Yeah. And I mean, when you said you knew everybody, but at the same time, you probably hadn't known many of them for that long, because it had only been about 6 months, maybe 6 months to a year.
I reflect about that too sometimes, because it's really, but it's kind of like, you know, how high school is only 3 years, but in those 3 years, you feel real bonded to those people. Well, I didn't really especially feel bonded, but it seems like a longer period of time, I guess is what I'm trying to say. It's kind of like that. I can't speak for everybody else, but for me, punk rock was the San Francisco punk rock scene was my high school. It was everything I wanted high school to be, and I was popular, you know. And it was like, you know, and it was with people that had similar backgrounds, at least insofar as their relationship to their parents and you know, general attitude towards authority and all that sort of thing.
Yeah. And was that, I'm guessing you, somewhere in this period, you went from living in Vallejo to living in the city. And was that your first place in living in San Francisco, that apartment there at Mission and 30th?
Think about that for a
Or
second.
I'm trying to picture this. I don't know if you went straight from your parents' house to living there, or if you had other places.
Okay, I see what you're saying. Yeah, when I got out of high school, I moved to South Lake Tahoe, at the state line of between Nevada and California. There's you've heard of South Lake Tahoe? There's casinos there. Anyway, I moved up there and became a cook. Had got a job as a room service chef, and but I would come home to Vallejo every so often, and then when I was home, I would go to the city and go and watch bands play. And then as a teenager, even before we were old enough to do it legally, we would go to the nightclubs and watch all the bands that were popular in the pre-punk era. And then I guess it was about a year and a half, something like that I came back and stayed, because my mom had gotten cancer. And so I ended up as a sort of caregiver kind of situation with my mom, which was a really weird dynamic, because I had a real sort of estranged and difficult relationship with my mom. But here she was on her dying bed, and I was the kid that was there. So yeah, it was really something. In some ways, it was real. It was, you can imagine, it was a combination of feelings that I went through. But overall, I would say it was a pretty healing experience. But I digress. Back to music. I moved to Vallejo, and I had a job lined up before I came back, but I quickly lost it, and I was eligible for unemployment. And I was eligible for unemployment, so I was collecting unemployment. I was eligible for Social Security, so I was collecting Social Security. And we had figured out this way to go out in the fields and pick these like weeds. They were called cardone. We'd go down to the flower market in San Francisco and sell them for like a nickel a piece to the shop owners. And that added up to a lot of money, especially since I was already collecting all that shit. So I got a big chunk of money and bought all my gear. And then I stopped doing that, and all I did was play music. But I was still collecting all that other stuff. So I was doing pretty good.
I heard somebody else describe it as being like basically arts funding.
Yeah.
Because, you know, European countries will actually just directly fund that. But
right. It was our version. We don't even have that now, but I mean, at least not to the extent we did back then. But that was right around the Reagan era, and so there was still some of the safety nets were a little stronger still. You know, they were being whittled away. But exactly, I mean, my mom had passed away, so I got Social Security for going to school. I would go to school, and then I'd get a chance to go on a gig, like Jorma, for example, had offered me to go to Italy, I think, during that time. And anyway, whatever I was being offered was better than going to school, so I wouldn't make it to school, and I would end up, you know, not completing my class, but I still got the money. I don't know how exactly that worked. I guess because I'd already gotten the money. So anyway, what was the question?
Yeah, let me come up with one. Well, I wanted to ask something more about Jorma, but I'll come back to that. Was that when you started playing music, or you must have been playing music before?
Oh yeah, I played music. Well, see, I was a kid that loved the music as a kid, and like I didn't have that many friends, but the friends I did have, we were like the only friends in school that had long hair and listened to rock and roll. You know, Vallejo was only 30 miles north of San Francisco, and it sat right on the bay. But yeah, it had a real small town sort of. In general, the attitude of the city itself was pretty conservative. You know, it was a working class oil refinery, naval shipyard kind of town. And so, yeah, and we were the only kids in school that really bonded on rock and roll music and smoking pot and all that kind of stuff. And so I really wanted to play music. Even before that, I wanted to play music. The first time I saw the school band play, I wanted to play music. But we didn't have much money, so I didn't really get a chance to get a guitar until I was probably about 10 or 11. And I remember I begged my mom like crazy to buy me this funky classical style guitar with, you know, catgut strings and everything. It just happened to be on sale at the music store, and she got it for me. It was a piece of shit, but I mean, as a kid, it was great for me. And but the other kids had better stuff and everything, so I was kind of jealous. I remember being kind of jealous, and but I started playing, and I found a couple other kids to play with, and we had a little high school band. And as soon as I left after high school and moved up to South Lake Tahoe, I got a nicer electric guitar. It still wasn't a very rock and roll guitar. I had a very brief period where I was interested in jazz, and I took lessons from this guy that worked at he owned a music store down there, but yeah, so I've been playing music pretty much my whole life. I had a high school band, and I took lessons, and every time I would be in my hometown, I would frequent Rather Ripped Records was a place that we almost lived at. We used to love going there and looking for records. That's how I discovered punk rock more as a global thing. Prior to that, I'd only known about a couple of local bands.
So you started on guitar, not bass.
Yeah, I'm glad you asked me that, because I'm a little vapid, and I kind of lose my train of thought here.
Oh no, I was just because I only I believe that you played bass in most.
No,
of
you're
the bands.
right. No, I appreciate that you're asking me these questions, because I lose my train of thought and I forget. Yeah. I really loved guitar, but there was something about the bass that really moved me, and I was the kind of kid that I wanted to play music so bad I would literally play any instrument that the band needed. Like, I remember playing keyboards in a band. I played guitar in one of my own bands, but I started really liking the bass a lot, and so from as a teenager, I began to primarily play bass. Part of the reason was because I loved the bass. I loved the way I just loved the way it felt, when you listen to a song and that bass comes up like I don't know how to explain it, but I remember just loving it, and it was real easy to get gigs as a bass player, because bands always needed a bass player. At one time, after I moved to San Francisco, I was in as many as 5 bands, and playing gigs almost every night. So,
okay. Well, let's see. Let me see if I can name some of those. The Offs, Belfast Cowboys, Jorma's band. Who were some of the others mixed in there?
Oh man, I would play with anybody that needed a bass player. I can't even remember half the time I played. I remember filling in for the and playing with the Mutants. I remember playing with these brothers. I can't remember their name right now, but they were brothers that had a band.
Oh, the Stench Brothers?
Oh no, not the Stench Brothers. I remember the name of the band was called the Verves, and yeah, I mean, I would literally play with anyone. I just, and if I got a chance to play with somebody that I felt was better than that was definitely a plus. But I would play with. It didn't matter how good they were or how bad they played, or even sometimes how much I liked the music they played. I just loved to play. And yeah, I would. What other bands? Gee whiz, I just can't think right now. Just nobody really big. I hung out with Flipper a lot, but not enough to say I played with them. I think I filled in maybe one time, or I remember them. I remember there was a show where I did this isn't playing music, but it just so happened to pop up in my head that I remember this this one period of time or time. I don't know if I did it just once or more than once, but I remember doing a magic show before the Flipper concert, and I drank a bit, of course, and it was a punk rock. The concept was that I was a sort of a punk rock approach to magic trick and to magic, and what that means is, to me, is that I had no experience with magic and the tricks didn't work, and so it was kind of funny. At least it was to me and my friends. I remember that we loved it. I don't think the club owner loved it so much because I made a mess of eggs and beer and all kinds of crap all over the stage.
Well, it's funny because they toured. I mean, I've heard stories about their, the later version of Flipper that toured Australia in maybe 2009. They toured Australia, and their tour manager is someone who, I don't know if he was performing on that tour, but he did actually a kind of magic act that is not too far from what you described. Like, it was kind of inept magic. Flipper and magicians and punk magicians. It's just kind of a weird coincidence. But I was thinking about, the bass thing, what you were saying about bass. Somebody like Will, the stories I've heard about him is that he basically picked up a bass and was, in the band the next week. And that was often kind of the story that people would tell about, this idea, punk comes and people pick up their instruments. And I imagine there was a fair amount of that.
Oh, yeah.
I guess you were sometimes in bands with people who were, more recent, in terms of picking up their instruments.
Absolutely. That's why I say I would play with people regardless of how experienced or inexperienced they were, because for me, enthusiasm was more important than the ability to play. I mean, I don't care if somebody had to mark the fretboard with the notes or something, or whatever it takes, or if they didn't even care what notes they played, it didn't matter. It was the feeling they put into it. It was the enthusiasm that they had. It was how they just took over the stage and expressed emotions and anger and all these feelings, in a way that wasn't so prepackaged and commercial, because that was the music scene had kind of degenerated into this. I don't know what you'd classify that music, but you know how rock got before punk rock. It got really syrupy, and
when you hear people talk about San Francisco in, say, 75, 76, it was like, oh, it's bleak. It's aging hippies and kind of corporate rock and Bill Graham and Winterland. And at the same time, I would hear from, say, someone like Michael told me about going up to, to Winterland in, say, 1974 and being really into whether it was the James Gang or Robin Trower. Yeah. So there, I guess there was like mixed in there with that boring music scene, there would still be good stuff. I mean, do you remember going to Winterland or any of those?
Yeah, I went to Winterland all the time. But of course it was it was more than going to Winterland was going to the city, going to concerts and drinking and smoking pot and seeing all these different bands. And there was a sort of a in my mind, the way I remember it, it was like sort of a pre-punk period before before the movie Mabuhay really sprung up, and there was the pre-punk era where basically everything went. I mean, I loved it. I remember going to what did they call that at Winterland? They had these local sort of not local, but they had Tuesday. They had these Tuesday shows that were cheaper. I remember going to Kiss concerts. I'm thinking they were pretty fucking hot, and James Gang. I saw them all. Robin Trower. It didn't matter who they were. I would basically get obliterated and try to find our way back to Vallejo. Not always making it.
I guess the difference would be that you probably would have a hard time picturing yourself, actually being up on the stage in that era, or there was a much bigger separation between, obviously between the musicians and the.
I would say so. I mean, of course, we were younger then, so it was. So I mean, it was well. I can't speak for other people, but I would say, judging by the fact that we all wanted to have bands and that's all we talked about was bands, having a band, playing in bands, that we aspired to be musicians. And there was a period when I kind of fell for the commercial stuff to some degree, but it was like punk rock came out sort of just at the same time that it both expressed and drove that anti-commercial feeling. Just as I was feeling bored and sick of that kind of music and really starting to develop an unusual kind of hatred for that sort of approach to music, then punk rock was there just to go right into. Does that make sense? Sleepers had a gig or two booked, and but for some reason the bass player and drummer weren't playing. Or I remember a specific show where, and I may have already told you about.
Yeah, you told me about it, but it's a really good story about up at the Mabuhay or on Broadway or
whatever that was called on top of Mabuhay there. I think it was on Broadway or off Broadway. And I told you the story about how Ricky had done this pirouette on stage and ended up falling flat and knocking himself out, and they carried him out in a ambulance stretcher. It was the most insane thing you ever saw. And that was pretty much, in my memory, that was where Clocks in Paradise started, because we were stuck with that lineup without Ricky. So I don't even remember for a little bit, I don't think we had a singer. And then we had Connie.
In the midst of playing in the offs, you did the Belfast Cowboys with Roz and I guess a couple of guys from the Avengers.
Yeah, it was Roz, Danny, who I love to death. We were pretty tight for a while there, and Jimmy, who I also love, and God, I miss him. Let's see. Yeah, I think that was all of us. Roz, Danny, Jimmy, and me.
Yeah, and I think there were just a few. Y'all played a handful of shows, but it sounded like they were all pretty big events. Roz was telling me about that.
Right.
That it was mostly at that point it was mostly covers, but then there was one song that "Running with the Fast Crowd" that
Right.
yeah.
Yeah, that got butchered by Yorma, by the way, which was partially my fault, but partially it was, I don't know. I'm not sure yet how much responsibility to take for, for that happening. I played a big part in this because I introduced it to Yorma, but the lyrics definitely got butchered, and I wasn't happy with how it came out, and I know Roz hated it. But yeah, that was I think the only original song, and I remember the original version. I wish we had a recording of it because it was so different than anything that got recorded by anyone else. It was more of a it had more of a kind of a Mata Hoople feel to it. If you listen, if you were to hear it, if you were to hear the song, you could imagine a kind of Mata Hoople feel to it. It was perfect for Belfast Cowboys because of it fit in really well with the type of covers we did, which were all party songs. And after the first gig, we booked any other gig, which I don't remember how many. There was only a handful, but I remember our posters always said that it was our final show, although we had several final shows.
One of those shows might have been the first show that Bruce did with Flipper, although it might have been the second one. It would have been right after the little period when Ricky was singing with them. But boy, that would be asking a lot of somebody to remember a kind of a random show from 43 years ago. But did anything else stand out about those Belfast Cowboys shows? Or
What I remember of that show was that we had these bottles of vodka um, martinis pre-mixed with like a Belfast Cowboy sort of branding put on them, just sort of artificially. And we had a bunch of plastic glasses that kind of looked like martini glasses. I think they were, I don't know what they were meant to be, wine glasses or whatever. But they were plastic glasses, and we handed out free martinis to everybody while we were playing. And then I remember seeing Roz with "Do You Think I'm Sexy" carved into his chest, and one of those plastic glasses full of Valium or something. And he was posing for a photo. I don't know if anything came of that photo. I never saw it, but I remember that image that kind of, burned into my amygdala. I think I'm traumatized by Belfast Cowboys.
When I'm stuck in the valley of the dolls, I can laugh about anything now. In the right atmosphere.
I don't know if it seemed like ancient history, or I don't know how it would have seemed, but Yorma, having played in Jefferson Airplane, he was a solo artist at that point, and
After Jefferson Airplane, yeah.
okay, yeah, and wait, he was in Hot Tuna as well, right? Um,
Yeah, yeah, Jefferson Airplane, and then Hot Tuna, which came out of that him and Jack would play.
right, right, right. So that okay, so I can't remember all of this, but so you played with Bob Steeler, who was a member of Hot Tuna, you played alongside him in the offs, and then you played alongside Jorma in Jorma's band. But do you remember which one of those led to the other?
Yeah. Well, I was in the ops and Bob Steeler was the drummer. And yeah, so bass players and drummers, they either make a connection or they don't. And Bob Steeler, we had a pretty good connection as far as the drum bass player thing, and we were pretty tight, I would say. And I remember he was playing with Hot Tuna, and if I remember correctly, they had a bunch of shows booked, but they were having some tip or something. They weren't getting along, and I mean Jorma and Jack, and so there were all these shows already booked for Hot Tuna, and they needed a bass player, and Bob was real enthusiastic about me and basically sort of plugged me to Jorma, and Jorma came and saw us play a gig at the Temple Beautiful, and yeah, he was down after that with wanting me to play with him, which I thought that was cool. They were going to be basically just gigs on the side that paid pretty well. I wasn't a Hot Tuna fan, and the best I can say about that is that as a kid, I mean, I loved the whole San Francisco psychedelic hippie era, and I remember like Jefferson Airplane, the Volunteers of America album was actually one of the first records I had, but I was a kid, I mean, it was like, probably stacked on my turntable with the Monkees or something. I remember listening to that music, and it was iconic, of course. But after that, I mean, I was not a Hot Tuna, and that whole kind of thing was a little bit boring to me. And in the context of the San Francisco punk scene, it was a little bit. It kind of was it pulled away from my street cred a little bit. It's not like I wanted everybody to know, hey, I play with Jorma too, God, I sound like an asshole for saying it, but I was.
No, it's completely understandable. I remember you telling me about that the last time that you had that kind of feeling, but I think that's understandable because I mean, you also mentioned that you appreciated it more in hindsight that you did play with him, and
Yeah.
but I think the idea at the time was, this is a rejection of these stale hippies, and so to turn around and it's not like that's necessarily fair that everyone in those bands should be treated as a pariah or that everything they ever did was a bad thing, but you also had, what was it, SVT that Jack Cassidy was doing, and so
Exactly.
Again, it's like that wouldn't be, I don't think anybody would bat an eyelash today, or that you could even have any kind of equivalent sort of.
Yeah.
But then it was like it was a real distinction between what the hippie era stood for versus what the punk era stood for.
It was an identity thing, like I was saying before. Music was a real identity thing, and that feeling was reciprocated. I mean, and a little more clearly expressed. I mean, the audience just hated me because, like, as soon as we'd come out, like, one of the first things I would hear shouted is, "Where's Jack?" Me and Danny were laughing about this. People just threw shit at me when I was up on stage, and I just was like, I was in my element when that happened. I was like, yeah. Oh, God. But Danny was laughing about because they were throwing shit. They were throwing pennies and bottles and everything at me. And then Danny said somebody threw a fucking camera. I don't know. It's probably one of those portable cameras or something. I'm not sure because I don't remember it. But people were just throwing junk at me. It didn't even matter what it was.
Running with a fast crowd. No, I can't compete. Running with a fast crowd while I'm living on the street.
There's a lot of stuff that was interesting stuff that wound up on the cutting room floor as far as the book goes. But you, in particular, I remember you telling me about New York versus San Francisco in that time, and particularly with reference to kind of the drug situation, but maybe just in general, like what you remember, because I think you spent some time there in New York. I don't think you lived there, but you maybe had a lot of gigs there, and maybe would have extended stays there, if I remember right.
Yeah, I stayed in New York a lot. We had these friends, Pat and Emily, that had a video company or something. They had a whole library of videos of everybody, including us. And they had an apartment on Orchard Street, lower side, of Manhattan. So it was right there, right where everything was. And we would have a bunch of gigs, and I would usually stay there. And then anytime I was in New York, even after I left the office, I would stay at Pat and Emily's. Like when we came back from Germany and all that stuff, I stayed with them. But and I remember anytime the Offs played in New York, we had some extended stays then before they moved out there. The problem with New York was that I loved it. It would have been good for me. I considered it strongly for a while. But to this day, it affects my life. I had a very strong proclivity to getting strung out on dope. I mean, that's one of the things that Michael and I bonded on. I was a fucking junkie, and I knew that if I stayed in New York, it was just too easy to score, and just too easy. And I knew that it would be to my demise to stay there, and that's the reason why I went back to San Francisco. And even when I went back to San Francisco, it was with the thought that I might go back to New York, because San Francisco was already sort of going through a brief little period of there wasn't a whole lot happening for probably only a few months, but because things seemed to pick up after I left. But at least from my perspective, it didn't seem like for at least a few months there wasn't a whole lot happening. And so I was working jobs, and if there was another place that was easy to get dope, it would be San Francisco. I got strung out really bad there, and Rank and File came through town. They were living in Austin already, and they played a gig, and I was real tight with Tony.
Right. Okay.
Yeah, and he said, he could tell I was struggling a little bit. And so he said, Denny, you got to come to Austin. And I think partly was he wanted to save my life, But yeah, it sounded exciting to me at the time. And I was at the bottom of my methadone detox, which is this thing you go through where you start out at a certain dose and then you start titrating down. And then by the time you're at the lower dose, like it goes, basically 2, 3, 1, and then you're out. And I was just finished a methadone taper, and I was working some shitty restaurant job. I don't know what I had as far as equipment goes, but I don't think I had much going as far as that goes either. I think I had to buy equipment again when I got out to Austin. But anyway, so Tony says, you got to come out to Austin. You love it there. It's got a great scene. You have all kinds of bands to play with. And so I think it was the weekend of their show that they were telling me that, mostly Tony, although the other guys were just as enthusiastic about Austin. And it was Friday or Saturday, they were telling me, and by Monday, Tuesday, I was in the van with them going back to Austin. And I dug it. I loved the Austin scene. When we went out to New York, one of the places we stopped and played was Austin. So, there were some people that had already heard of the Offs. So I had my in, and I started trying out for bands and everything and started playing. But it was cool. I fell in love with Austin, to be honest, right away. What I loved was the diversity of music that there was there. I remember the first week I got here, and this friend of mine who later became my roommate, Dennis Nowland, came by and said, "Hey, you guys, we gotta go to this place called the Broken Spoke and see Ernest Tubb play." And it was being shot back in time 100 years or something. Ernest Tubb was an old feller by then, but
right, but it's still the real deal. And
yeah, a real deal and a honky tonk, and he played the same show I imagine he played of half his life. It was really something to see. Backstage he had a oxygen or something, and he looked pretty frail, but yet he was still out there playing, and it struck me. It just struck me how important music was to his life and to people in general, and then also how it was kind of like a handing of the torch over to the other younger musicians. I mean, I don't know. It was just cool to see. And there was a lot of old country bands. There was a big punk rock scene. There was a big reggae scene. For some reason, reggae bands that would play in the major cities would always stop and play in Austin. It was a great music scene, great people. And I ended up, and it was a big scene, and it kind of reminded me of San Francisco a little bit. In fact, there is sort of a San Francisco Austin connection that goes back quite a ways.
Yeah, and then at that time, there would have been both Rank and File, and then I don't know at what point the True Believers formed, but that came along a little bit later.
Yeah. So, all right. So I came down to Austin with Rank and File, and I was roommates with Tony for a little while. But anyway, at some point, Rank and File either broke up or Alejandro quit or something, but they parted ways. And Alejandro's brother was living I think it was in San Francisco at the time, or he was in San Diego, I don't know. But he came out to start a band with us. It was me and Alejandro and Javier, and then this other guy, John D. Graham. He's a real good guitar player that played locally here. And we had a few drummers, but anyway. So we started True Believers after they parted ways. Javier moved out here, and I was already pretty close friends with Javier just because of the San Francisco scene. And so we started playing gigs right away. And yeah, things seemed to go pretty fast, because the next thing I know, we were shopping producers, and we ended up with a deal with EMI Capital, and that's what that record came out on. I was thrilled to be able to say that we were playing on EMI Capital. That sounds pretty badass.
And then it was Jim Dickinson who was the producer
Yeah.
on that, who's kind of a legend.
A legendary producer for sure, or musician all around. Yeah. Yeah, man, that was quite an experience. And True Believers toured all over the country. We never really got to go to Europe, but we toured all over the United States. And you know, we met so many people. I feel like I have friends all over the country, primarily because of True Believers, but also we became really tight. I mean, you can imagine living in a van, being on the road, going from gig to gig. I mean, we'd come back home for a few months, but we were on the road a lot and played a lot, enough to where we put ourselves on salary and just sort of dealt with the money that way, you know, which was kind of different. Getting paychecks from the band.
Yeah. And I don't know how that ended, apart from Alejandro eventually having a solo career, because I had heard of him before. I'd heard of a lot of this other stuff. It seemed like, as I look it up, there was the one album, and then poof.
How it ended. Okay. Well, it didn't end all at once. It was like, so from my perspective, I left the band, and then they kept going for a while, and they eventually broke up. And I say I left the band, basically I was kicked out or fired or whatever way you want to put it. And that was tough, man. It's like, I know so many musicians that play in so many bands, and leaving a band for whatever reason is absolutely no big deal. But for some reason it really struck me. I mean, I guess because I'm like that. I was really attached, but it wasn't like without any reason. What happened was we had this really big gig, and anytime I was in New York, I would get strung out. I mean, it's like a moth to flame, you know. It didn't take very long for me to get a little habit going. I came there with one. And so we had this big gig where there was a record guy coming out to a scout or something to come out and see us play. We were doing like this Austin show. And so, you know, I wanted to make sure I felt good to do a good show. And I went down to, the Lower East Side and to score some dope. And, right around that time, New York was starting to do their drug sweeps and all that shit. And I got caught up in one. And I got busted. with heroin possession, and they took me, well, obviously to jail, and I didn't get out for a few days, and obviously I missed the gig, and boy did I piss those guys off. So that's how the band broke up from my perspective. We played some more shows, but it was real tense. And then by the time we got back to Austin, I don't know how you want to say it, but I left the band, and then they continued and got another bass player. They went through a couple, and I don't remember what else, but I know that that they played for a while, and then at some point they broke up. I think there was some tension between Javier and Alejandro, but they broke up, and Javier went back to LA, San Diego, and and Alejandro started his solo career, did a thing called Buick McCain. Seems like there was more than that, but yeah, he carried on. He was fucking Alejandro, he persevered, man. He's something else.
Yeah, I wonder, thinking about there's Rank and File, True Believers, and then even what Jimmy Wilsey was doing with Chris Isaac in the 80s, there was this turn to a lot of Americana, roots rock, whatever you'd call it, before there was the term alternative country, which, not that this stuff was really alternative country, but is that something that you could have foreseen in 1978, that wow, in 2 or 3 years there's going to be this interest in kind of roots American music, or where do you think that came from? That's a big question. I don't know.
Yeah, well, it kind of is. Yeah, there was a bunch of us. Jimmy, Danny, the drummer from the Avengers, who briefly played drums, by the way, with Jorma. We did a tour together. Rank and File, of course, and just there was a small little faction of people that began to appreciate. I mean, Jimmy Wilson turned me on to a lot of country music, and it was kind of like, people just started to have more of an open mind about old stuff, old classic country and stuff like that, and it just kind of seeped into the music. Could you have foreseen it?
Well, I guess what I'm asking is, was that interest already there? I guess is
yeah, I saw it develop. There were probably a couple people where the interest was already there. Like, as far as I remember, Jimmy always loved country music. He turned me on to so much stuff, like, everything from Hank Williams to Johnny Horton, Letty Frizzell. Same with Tony and Chip. They were big country music fans, and after you saw it sort of start to develop, it kind of caught fire, and there were a few bands that were called country punk. That's what they called alternative country,
or even cowpunk, I guess.
Yeah, cowpunk. Yes.
Yeah,
I forgot about that.
Yeah, because I guess in a lot of ways it makes sense, given that whatever punk rock is as a style, it's fairly limited, and I don't think it really was a style. If you look at the, say, Mabuhay era bands, there's certain things in common, but on the other hand, there's a pretty big difference between the Sleepers and the Mutants, or the Mutants and Crime. So it's not really a style, even if it's maybe considered to be a style nowadays. But I guess after a couple of years of stripped down, fairly loud music with relatively short songs, maybe the idea is we want to do something different. And I guess that was just one of the pathways out of that to something different, I guess. But
exactly, I agree. And like a lot of forms of music, punk rock was a folk music. I mean, just like country, and I mean, like we were saying before, it's an identity thing. Things get old and people want to identify with something that's considered new, even if it's something old. If nobody else is doing it, it's new.